Coming up, we take a look at Cam Thomas in the backcourt for the Brooklyn Nets and why he maybe should, could, and needs to take on a point guard role for the Nets this upcoming season. We break down all the key numbers live on YouTube coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I am Adam Arbrecht coming to you solo all week long, talking Brooklyn Nets basketball, where we thank you, as always, for making us your first listen of the day. We're 100% free on all those great platforms. And let you know, today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms, they do apply, though no terms apply when it comes to having a discussion around Cam Thomas and also doing it live on YouTube. As I said at the top, feel free. I don't know if we'll get fully into the comments or not. It just felt like a nice way during this solo week as Doug takes some much-deserved time away from the podcast. Then we jump back in here. We normally do these post-game lives over on YouTube in season, but there's not typically big reasons to get into these types of conversations when it comes to live broadcasts. But here we are. And when we think about Cam Thomas, there's a couple of things that came to mind because we've had this discussion before. And there's, first of all, some just statistical breakdowns when it comes to touches per game, dribbles per touch, points per touch in the paint, all these kind of things that when we look at with Cam Thomas and you want to see an expand, you can follow a thread back to if he's on the ball more, if he's dictating the offense more, it's going to give him a better opportunity to excel even into his offensive game as a pure scorer that we know he can be. And the first thing about this is we'll get into other players on this roster from Trendon Watford. We'll mention Ben Simmons, but Noah Clowney, veterans that are still on this roster in the front court. We'll get into how they need to shift, as well as Nicholas Claxton and Day'Ron Sharpe, maybe some of what they do. But at a very high level, when you go and look at the players that exited this team this past season to this point, and obviously chief among them is Mikal Bridges. Let's just talk about touches per game. 57, almost 58 touches per game for Mikal Bridges. Don't forget about Lonnie Walker Jr., 24. Don't forget about Dennis Smith Jr., 38.4 per game. We can mention Ben Simmons, even though it's a very small sample size. It'll factor in when we talk about who's going to be getting touches going into this upcoming season, 58.7 in his, again, limited action over this past year. And while you can look out and say, well, you brought in a guy like Bogdanović back over via trade, and he had 33 and a half touches per game a year ago. Is that going to factor in the same way when he comes over to Brooklyn? Most likely not. So even if you take out Ben Simmons, leave him to the side for a second, those three players that I mentioned, all of which exist in the backcourt for the Brooklyn Nets, that's 140 touches per game that need to be figured out and accounted for, and need to be accounted for from a ball handling standpoint too. And you can go back and look at the way when Mikal Bridges was forced to be on ball and forced to kind of, dictate action on his own. It was not always the prettiest looking sets on the offensive end. So that's a problem unto itself, that some of the highest touch guys that you're losing also are guys that shouldn't have been touching the ball nearly as much. Remember, almost 58 touches for Mikal Bridges. So the two key guys to think about when it comes to Brooklyn in this backcourt is obviously Cam Thomas and then Dennis Schroder. And we're going to also talk about some other guys that are hopefully going to get opportunities here when we come into this season. 54.9 touches per game for Cam Thomas a year ago. That's pretty darn high. It's 55th among guards in the backcourt. We talk about the NBA, but it is 83rd overall. So he is top 100 already in terms of touches per game. But compare it to Schroder, who had 75.1, 16th in the NBA. Now, pure point guard responsibilities, obviously. And if you just go the layer deeper to say, well, what's the discrepancy here potentially? They both had, in terms of front court touches, basically identical numbers, 30.9 for Thomas, 30.2 for Schroder, excuse me. So you're talking about who's getting the ball coming off of made buckets, coming off of rebounds, getting into the transition game, and getting out and starting to set up this offense. But you're accounting for 20-plus additional touches on average per game. And Schroder being the 16th highest touch total, coming over via the trade, obviously, when you look at that, you have to at least figure out at 30, 31 years old, and we've heard comments from Schroder, he wants to be here. Recently, his last couple of days coming off his performance in Germany, wants to be here, wants to help be a culture setter, wants to help teach these young players. So that is great. That's exactly the mold that you want of a guy, especially in a group like the backcourt where the Nets can't afford to maybe treat it, as we said before, like a Cam Johnson, like a Dorian Finney-Smith. Hey, we've got a lot of guys in the front court. Let's try to find ways to move off some of these veterans and clear out minute shares. You need him to be a part of this, but you also, at some point, want him to take a little bit of a back seat to other players that can grow into these opportunities. Whether or not that's specifically Cam Thomas, could be a Keon Johnson that we're optimistic that he can carve out a role for himself as well. But you want to find a little bit of a passing of the torch here. So in that regard, there's a couple of other things when we talk about touches per game. Outside of Schroder and outside of Bridges and the very small sample size on Ben Simmons, it's Cam Thomas. He's the guy that's getting the most touches. One notable thing about too, when you look at the touches per game, like I found it interesting. Let's put it that way. Claxton has over 45 touches a game. That's what you expect. He's doing a lot of work on the defensive end. Offensively, he's going to be in and around the basket. Even though Day'Ron Sharpe, limited role, limited sample size, I will have to look down to the notes a couple of times here. 26 touches per game for him as well. But then you extend it out and you think about Dorian Finney-Smith, almost 38 touches per game. Cam Johnson, almost 38 and a half, 39 touches per game. If you're talking about those two players specifically, now they're not built exactly the same, almost exclusively pure spot-up shooter when we talk about Dorian Finney-Smith. I mean, traditional 3-and-D. We were optimistic that Johnson could have a little bit more of an offensive repertoire. But if you go over to craftednba.com and look at players like this, well, guess what? You're going to find out that their primary function, as you would expect, is spot-up shooter. And almost, aggressively so, to the point where you cannot look at the number of touches and probably not make some case for the fact that this is a player who is probably wasting a bit of it. Now, in the case of Cam Johnson, you're talking about spot-up shooter, 37%, almost 40% of the time. Next closest is going to be pick and roll ball handle. And you need him to do some of that if you're going to be in this role, if you're going to be in this system, if you're going to have this kind of roster. And we're going to talk about how he needs to shift a little bit. But Cam Thomas lives here as the third highest functioning ball handler from a year ago. Mikal Bridges is gone. We don't think, nor do we want Ben Simmons to be averaging almost 60 touches a game, because it just means that he's getting in the way of other players' development. It means that he's getting away of the long-term future, right? And then you talk about Schroder again. He's still going to be high volume. Can any other player come in and carve out a significant role? That's the question that starts to get asked here. And if you believe in not only Cam Thomas as the pure scorer, but also as a player that's going to be here long-term, you have to find a way to put the ball in his hands and then say, now go create. And there's some comparables out here that I wanted to get to, just looking around the league from a very high level, that make it interesting, including coming up here in a second, talking about how, sometimes we think, it gets very bogged down when the ball is in Cam Thomas's hands and he can really over dribble and, find himself stagnating the offense and then having to make some of these incredible shots that we see him take and often make. But there's a few different things inside of that I did find pretty interesting. So we're going to get into some more stats around him and why, if you can get him into more of a point guard role, it will probably serve to actually benefit his game in totality, and then also benefit other players on this roster in terms of clear role definition and the way you want to function on the offensive end. We'll continue to get into that as we roll live over on YouTube, coming up here in just one moment. Before we do that, though, got to tell you about our friends over at eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything that you need to maintain your vehicle and level up to a peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and so much more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. All right, so as we continue to roll along here live on YouTube on a Tuesday, talking about Cam Thomas, talking about roles, minute shares, expectations, and how we get there, just a quick tip of the cap, man. I was going to do our first episode of the week. We've been cutting down at least over the month of August, not doing as many episodes each week until we get to September, and then we'll ramp back up to our typical 5 days a week. But when you're over on X and you're letting people know there's going to be a programming change, just on a high level, man. Peter Rossini, he came in and mentioned it. Cage also came in and really just it sent appreciation my and Doug's way in terms of showing up and doing this podcast and being consistent with it and finding interesting, we hope, content to bring to Brooklyn Nets fans. It goes both ways. You guys keep showing up to support us. So I want to just make a point to shout everybody out, including everyone that's in here live on YouTube right now. It means the world that you guys afford me to be doing this as my daily job, my full-time commitment. So it's a lot of fun. That being the case, let's turn our attention then over to some of the other things that I think matter when we talk about it. So I was mentioning there about the other part of how Cam Thomas functions in the offensive end for the Brooklyn Nets. Average seconds per touch, and then also dribbles per touch. So you would think that there'd be some kind of ratio here that maybe skews a little bit higher in terms of dribbling, higher in terms of on ball, getting lost in the sauce a little bit, potentially having the offense stagnate. But you can compare Thomas favorably against Jaylen Brown, against Derek White, against Tyus Jones, who I think is kind of an interesting player to look at in these comparisons. Anywhere from Cam Thomas, 4.03 seconds per touch, dribbles per touch, 3.56. Those numbers line up perfectly with all these other players. And does he have the defensive, prowess of a Jaylen Brown? Of course not. Does he have the high-end facilitator value that we saw out of Tyus Jones, who then had to go and sign a, vet minimum contract this offseason? No. But just in terms of pushing away some of maybe what would be the concerns about this, because we saw a year ago the growth of Cam Thomas. Hey, watch out. Here come blitzing defenses. They're going to send a second defender at you. They're going to try to attack you well out beyond the arc and get the ball out of your hands, or force you to pick up your dribble and then get into a bad situation where you're calling timeouts or giving up turnovers, right? But then we saw Cam Thomas adjust to that. See the scheme, adjust to it, get the ball out of your hands, and put into someone else who can create. And that's the other problem that we get to here in terms of why ball handling for Cam Thomas may just need to be a part of what he does this season. And I think ultimately in a good way for his development. But if you think about, I mentioned Ben Simmons, I don't care which way you slice it. We are not excited to see him being overutilized this season. Doug and I, when we were doing our minutes breakdowns, I think I put him at 15. We're saying, is that a little bit too low? Doug had him, I think, up at 20 or 21 minutes, something around there. Was that, I mean, you split the difference, right? Something around 18. Now, some people have said if he's on this roster day one, he needs to be starting. And part of your case can be made on, well, because he's a guy that is one of the best ball handlers on this roster as currently constituted. My counterpoint would be, as I said at the top, other players that are going to step up in bigger ways, and I want to see other players get bigger minute shares. Trendon Watford averaged 28 touches a game, but he was not getting the minute share that you would expect for a player of his caliber. And he's the exact type of player who, if he can take on some of the ball handling duties, but not necessarily point guard duties. And I know that that's a lot of what we talk about here, this point forward kind of role. What I really want to see is when you go over and look at what did Trendon Watford do a lot of? I mean, he did a lot of spot up shooting for the way that we think about him as being this little bit, jack of all, master of none. He did a lot of spot up shooting, but the other thing they did a bit of, slightly more than Cam Johnson did, was pick and roll ball handler, excuse me. So if I'm looking at it from the standpoint of offensive setup and how we want to create opportunities, I don't need Cam Johnson to be much more, as long as he's on this roster, than spotting up in the corner and maybe taking an occasional guy off the dribble and trying to work the baseline, right? We saw some of it last year. It wasn't as good as I hoped it was going to be, and we don't know. Is he long for this roster, if not this summer, coming up on the trade deadline? Same thing for Dorian Finney-Smith, though. He can just stand in the corner and knock down those shots when they're available. And even if you go the extra layer and say we also like Jalen Wilson. Jalen Wilson only had 15.7 touches, but if you think about the minutes that he played per game, and then you go and look at Dorian Finney-Smith and Cam Johnson, you can just see that number. Like you can see that number and go look at our minute projections when we did the 240 breaking that down. I'm going to suck away some from Dorian Finney-Smith, only a lot from Dorian Finney-Smith. I'm going to take away a chunk from Cam Johnson, and I'm going to give a guy like Jalen Wilson more of those touches. But is he really much different than Cam Johnson when it comes to the offensive end? We'll see. Summer League MVP. That counts for something. But we'll have to see like how his growth is. But again, he's another spot-up shooter kind of guy. So what I need to figure out the way to do here is maximize my offensive value when I look at then Nicholas Claxton and I look at Day'Ron Sharpe and I say, how are we creating opportunities on the offensive end? And even though I bring up Trendon Watford and I say, okay, let's put the ball in his hands on occasion, pick and roll ball handler. But the other way that I want to work this is I want him to be setting the screen and I want Cam Thomas to be the ball handler in those instances. Because unlike some other players on this roster, what that opens up and affords you in the following sequence off the screen is different than if it's going to be someone like Nicholas Claxton or Day'Ron Sharpe, which we'll get to. It also factors in when you think about Noah Clowney. What is his role going to be and how can he help expand it? If he and Trendon Watford are players that you can look at and say, we believe that you can be screen setter to the top of the key when, and it can be Schroder as well, obviously, his offensive philosophy, when the ball is in the point guard's hands. Well, now all of a sudden, it's a little bit different and a little bit more expansive for what it forces defenses to do as you come around that curl, as you drive towards the paint, of which there is another notable stat here when it comes to Cam Thomas. Let's talk about paint touches and then points per paint touch. So it's funny, man. In terms of getting into the paint, nobody does it better than Luka. 1.1 touches in the paint per game. 1.1 on average, excuse me. Translating into 0.759 points. Don't you love to get down to the minutiae of stats? But what I found interesting was, as I mentioned, a guy like Tyus Jones, who's a big-time facilitator, undersized, not the offensive player that Cam Thomas is. But they have strikingly similar paint touches, 0.5 for Thomas, 0.3 for Tyus Jones, but then converting 0.827 for Cam Thomas. He converts when he gets there. He's not necessarily getting there as much as you might want. And I was looking around the league for other guys playing in the backcourt kind of roles. It was interesting when you think about a player and a team that has struggled of late to get over the hump of their developmental journey, who's had a lot of high picks, and that's the Detroit Pistons, and that's Cade Cunningham. He's in the paint 0.7 average touches, 0.525 points. So the ratio is off there. Cam Thomas converts, but is he getting into the paint enough? And that can be a byproduct of playing off ball and having a traditional point guard like Dennis Schroder set you up and find you going to the basket. But it's not, I don't think it's the best way to get Cam Thomas into the paint. The best way for Cam Thomas and for the team to function with Cam Thomas getting to the paint, the best way for Cam Thomas to get into the paint is to have the ball on his hands, to be taking guys off the dribble, to work into that space, to use his physicality, to use that presence, and then make decisions. And we know if you go and you look at him, you're going to see that his passer rating is not necessarily elite at this point. But we also talked about how down the back half of last season, that home stretch before he had the injury, there was a big opportunity there where you saw the increase in his assists per game. It rose commensurate with him just seeing the court a little bit better, reacting to the defenses a little bit quicker, and putting teammates into better positions. It's, again, why I just think that the experiment, if you want to call it that, of Cam Thomas as the point guard needs to be a part of the operation here. Coming up in a second, it's not just that I think you should give him the opportunity, it's that you need to. Because there's nobody else on this roster that you're going to look at and say, he gives us the best opportunity not to win games. I know we're all worried about tanking. Not that that's the biggest concern in the world, but he gives us the best opportunity to have a complementary offensive system throughout the course of a game and not have it solely be that we either, one, put high leverage pressure on Dennis Schroder to be that guy who is more than capable of being, or that we automatically say we got to get into these point forward operations to try to get ourselves across the line. We'll talk a little bit more about how it functions if you put Cam Thomas at the point guard role, and then you think about Nicholas Claxton, Day'Ron Sharpe, and why shifting the offensive setup should open up better opportunities across the board on the offensive end. All part of a fun journey. Live on YouTube right now, of which, by the way, when we close out here after our third segment, I will stick around because I see some people in here and I see a lot of comments. I can't do both when I'm flying solo, so whatever you're saying, We'll get to it. Stick around with us for a little bit after we wrap things up, and we will close out talking about a more well-rounded offensive system running through Cam Thomas when we get back here in just one moment. And as we wrap up today's Locked On Nets episode, not only live on YouTube, but also obviously on your podcast feeds wherever you get those, thank you for making us your first listen of the day. For your second listen, why don't you enjoy Locked On NBA podcast? There's no offseason in the NBA. You've seen that here. And Locked On NBA provides daily basketball analysis from national and local experts in 30 minutes or less. No one keeps you as informed or entertained as Locked On NBA outside of the Locked On Nets podcast. Available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast needs fulfilled. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. And it's your team. And it, my friends, is every single day. Okay, so I was mentioning about the roles of these other players and talking about a guy like Trendon Watford and being a little bit surprised when you talk about him being so much a spot-up shooter. Because when you think about Dorian Finney-Smith and Cam Johnson, there's a reason why you slot them into that role, because you don't have a high expectation about what they can expand into. Jalen Wilson, maybe that same kind of thing. Obviously, we like his nose for the rebounds, but primarily you want him knocking down, like he did in Summer League, a massive amount of triples. And that's what you want from Trendon Watford too. But I like the idea of when you're setting those high pick and rolls at the top, if I can get it to be Trendon Watford, which is different than when we talk about Noah Clowney. I put him into that category before as well. But just because both of those players then give you the ability to go ahead and do a dribble handoff if you want to, have Cam Thomas work into space, hopefully take out his primary defender. And now all of a sudden it's more than just rolling to a rolling big man like it would be with Claxton, like it would be with Day'Ron Sharpe. And that's not a negative. But if I can go ahead and have Trendon Watford potentially attack towards the basket, which is possible, or drop himself back and wait for that opportunity to have an above the break three. If those opportunities present themselves, now all of a sudden, guys that maybe, as currently constituted, don't offer the highest on-ball value, their value increases. If I can get a big to have to leave that paint, now I can talk about cutting on the baseline for Dorian Finney-Smith, for Cam Johnson, for Jalen Wilson, right? I can start to think about the spacing that it helps to open up. One of the biggest problems that the Brooklyn Nets have faced, since the dawn of time, has been affording defenses to play too congested inside the paint. And because you don't have guys on the perimeter that can be both and attack guys and take them off the dribble, you start to limit what opportunities you provide for other players. And you also start to limit what it looks like when a guy like Cam Thomas goes into the paint and primarily feels like a lot of the work that I'm going to have to do is going to be the contorting my body, making those fadeaway shots. He gets to the basket, he draws contact, he goes to the line at a high rate. That's all fantastic. But I want to have the opportunities where Cam Thomas is looking at the basket and now has a switch defensive assignment that he can go ahead and blow by and get to the rim in a hurry. So I just think that whether or not Cam Thomas will ever be destined to be the pure primary point guard for the Brooklyn Nets, as in you're not always going to have you're not always going to have another player that's your primary ball handler, and then options like a Trendon Watford, guys that can be a little bit at point forward, of course. But if I can uncap what I think Cam Thomas is capable of, then you're going to, I believe, see an offensive system that just flows a little bit easier, provides easier opportunities for the guys around him, and puts Cam Thomas in a better position to drop off those easy passes around the basket to Nicholas Claxton, to Day'Ron Sharpe. Because again, if I have Noah Clowney setting a screen at the top and I can free up Cam Thomas, Claxton, if he's in the game, if we're playing Claxton and Clowney together in the front court, well, now Claxton is just working the baseline. He's waiting for that soft lob to the top. And ideally, a little bit more functional and more productive than sometimes what we saw maybe from Spencer Dinwiddie, right? Some of those, hey, maybe moments. So I'd like to see that. And the bottom line being here too, just on a high level, and we've talked about this with our minutes breakdown. How do you spread out these minutes? And then you look into the backcourt and say, who gets them? Now, you want to say that Trendon Watford is going to be a little bit of that. So there'll be times when you could look in your backcourt and let's just say it's Cam Thomas and it's Trendon Watford. Okay. You want to put Jalen Wilson in there. You want to put Claxton. You want to put Clowney, or you got some nice length, good size, pretty good shooting all around. But where's that second unit going to come from? And this is maybe where people talk about, Keon Johnson only had 4 games up at the NBA level with the Nets. He averaged 22 touches a game. What do we see from him? What have we seen from him last year? What did we see from him in Summer League that suggest he might be, to whatever level of depth that he's sitting on the bench, he might be the closest thing you have to a guy that can do a little bit of everything, right? Is he strong enough to take on those challenges at the rim if we're talking about on the offensive end? We hope so. He's got plenty of on-ball capability. He can set up the offense a bit. So I don't know. And it's one of the biggest stumbling blocks thinking about this team and how you're going to construct it. Because developing youth is great, but you have to at least have the pieces in place so they can develop successfully. We don't want to have 15 wasted possessions in a given game because the offense just didn't have someone to get it running, to get it moving, to have it flowing. Some people might just say that's why Ben Simmons needs to have a role, because that's all that you have right now that you feel like you can consistently go to. My case would be, in a season like this, if the camp is going right, if you believe in Cam Thomas and Schroder and a little bit of Keon Johnson and Trendon Watford, hey, let's get out there and let's try to make this function now. Because the guys that I'm talking about in Cam Thomas, in Noah Clowney, in Nicholas Claxton, Day'Ron Sharpe, Jalen Wilson, these are the guys that are going forward with this roster or have the potential to, right? Keon Johnson, former first-round pick, same draft class as Thomas. Maybe he can carve out a role for himself. These are the guys a year from now when we're going to the draft and the Nets have a high draft pick that we're thinking, how does player X, Cooper Flag, fit into the operation? How are these guys going to complement off one another? So I want to figure out who can do the most for this team going forward. And if I look at Cam Thomas, I guess I don't want to be limiting in my expectations for him, because there's a world not too long ago, myself included, where it was, hey, listen, he's a microwave scorer off the bench. Well, he's more than that, right? All right. Maybe he's a burgeoning on being an elite level scorer in the NBA. All right. Maybe he's more than that. And maybe we need to stop maybe capping expectations and say, until you prove you can't do some of these things for us, we're going to keep putting a little bit more on your plate. And that comes down to Jordi Fernandez, the coaching staff, and finding ways to challenge some of these young players, Cam Thomas chief among them. That being the case, that's the case. Some numbers, some good stats. Even if you don't think he should be the point guard, he should be touching the ball darn near as many times as Schroder is every single game, because that's how you're going to be better on the court, because he's that good of a scorer, pure scorer, obviously. Well, we got to explore some of these other options. And it's fun. It's a good exercise to do in the offseason, in August, as we're looking around and waiting to see if there's going to be a little bit more buzz coming off of the Olympics, coming off of another gold medal, coming off of Steph Curry, sleepy time, beating France, right? Bringing home the gold. Like, these narratives are fun and they're circulating around the NBA, but we always got to bring it back home to Brooklyn and figure out how this team is going to attack this upcoming season from a developmental standpoint, leave the wins and losses off to the side. That being the case, my friends, we go ahead and let you know that you can get us over on YouTube. You can turn on your alerts in case you get surprised one morning on a Tuesday in the middle of August, where I'm going live. Get in on the conversation there. Get over your podcast feeds. Doug would tell you, leave a 5-star glowing review. 5 stars or bust. No reason to do anything else. 5 stars. Greatly appreciate it. And again, really, really appreciate everyone being a part of what we do, not only all season long, but all off season as well. And until next time, oh, baby, as we will stick around for a little bit on YouTube with everybody that's in there. When there is no Doug Norrie, there is no quote, short of saying that I miss my friend. And I can't wait till he's back so we can keep talking all things Brooklyn Nets basketball. Basketball, 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 basketball. Yeah. All right, everybody. If you stuck around in YouTube, I see the comments are flying. Again, when you're running solo, there's not a big opportunity to go ahead and look in and address them without probably derailing the entire episode. So if you have something up there, you know the deal. Usually when we go live, feel free to shout something out, put at Locked On Nets, obviously. I'll try to look back here a little bit, But it looks like, by the way, for the most part, if I'm reading the comments correctly, that you guys are just having a great time. You're just chopping it up around everything, including getting into some KD conversations versus the Bucks. So I like what I'm seeing there. I think we got, let's see. Yeah, you got ERA coming in with Watford is not a point guard, maybe point forward, obviously. But I just need him. We'll throw this one up on here, by the way. I'm remembering how we function when we're doing lives. Need him to get minutes. Yeah, just make positive plays, and I'm good with him at any position. We already have point guards. Yeah. And again, some people, and I'm sure that's been going on here in the conversation, talk about him getting into that role. Really, what it's about, it's the same thing with Ben Simmons, and we've talked about this before. They're not the same mold of player. It's not the same skill set, but just the idea of rebound comes down defensively. You grab it, you trigger the offensive break, you get everybody up the court. You allow Cam Thomas to be running off ball. You allow some of the shooters to space the floor. And then when it comes to maybe attacking in transition, if the weakness is there, if the spaces are available, Trendon Watford can go ahead and take a guy off the dribble and get the basket, right? So good decision making from him. That's going to be a part of his developmental process. We saw him start to get better down the stretch of the season. He needs to keep it clean. He can't come down like a bull in a china shop and sometimes get himself kind of in no man's land, uncertain about what his intentions are. But yeah, that's why I say I stopped short of saying, oh, he's going to be a point guard. Point forward is obviously the role, but it's interesting to think about how these pieces can all fit together. What else we got here? Anything else? Adam, hello. Hello, Richard. Glad you are finally addressing comments. It makes the show better. Oh, of course, man. Yeah, well, we always do. Again, when it's live, that's the trick of this. And maybe we'll do another one this week because I'm solo all week long. So we're going to be having a couple of conversations. Reached out over on X to everybody. Feel free. I'll post it up in the YouTube community sections. Like, what other things do you want to hear about? Some people talked about, your favorite Nets of all time or favorite moments. People talked about who should be have their number retired that hasn't yet. Obviously, Vince Carter's going to be getting that done coming up real soon. So things you want to do like that. And then maybe we'll also take a look at it. Potentially just coming back on live down later this week and just chopping it up and going full questions, open forum, and have some fun with it. Oren, frequent flyer. What's the next item to challenge Cam Thomas on? Ball distribution. Yeah, I mean, again, so I was mentioning this before. I really enjoy, you can go over to craftednba.com. I like the layout that they have there in terms of comparing players and getting a sense of where some of them succeed or fail. One of the things that I didn't get too deep on, because it's another discussion and it's an abstract one at best. If you talk about, and interestingly enough, by the way, if you label him as a two guard, Cam Thomas, positional size is a D+. But if you move him into that point guard role, and then you can put something, someone a little bit bigger alongside of him, it also helps change kind of the outlook there. But if you look at a player like this, and I said before about Tyus Jones, do you need to be this pure point guard in every single attribute? Of course not. But in looking at that comp over there, as I'll get it up in the background, the thing that jumps out is ball distribution, as you mentioned there. Creations, there's a couple different things, and I didn't get to this in episode either. The box creation, a per 100 estimate of the number of open shots created for teammates. Cam Thomas is already 83rd percentile. Tyus Jones is 98th percentile in that. So, I mean, it's impressive some of the things that Tyus Jones can do for you, and then shocking that he ends up just being a guy that can't really, find a big contract for himself this offseason. So he's already a creative player, but the passer rating, 40th percentile for Cam Thomas, 99th percentile for a guy like Tyus Jones. So you think about these, pure point guards, and you could even go the extra step and say, well, why not just compare him to the guy that's on the roster and say, if you're going to sit here and tell me that there's going to be times when we want to put Dennis Schroder on the bench and let Cam Thomas run the offense fully. Again, Cam Thomas relative to Schroder's 93rd percentile in passer rating. Creation, 88th percentile as well, right? So obviously that pure point guard mentality is not ingrained in Cam Thomas, but creation standpoint, in terms of the offensive load that he's taken on already, he's 89th percentile in that. And that's a little bit of this too. When you think about, not to mention there's a few other numbers to get into here about this, but when you look at some of the creation turnover percentages per 100 possession, he's in the 73rd percentile there. Like, he does a lot of things really well that if you can just start to get the pieces moving around him a little bit and get some more functional offensive sets happening, I think organically you would see him grow a little bit more into that distributor, that facilitator. And as I said, we saw him do it down the stretch of last season more so than he had. It just hasn't looked that way over the entirety of the season. So that would be my next area for him. Oren, you came right back in. Great stats. Had no idea how to quantify this before. Well, that's it. That's what you come here for. You come here to be blown away by my incredible stats and how I quantify. that's what it's all about. But yeah, it's interesting just to think about how this is going to flesh out. Harlem, Adam, why the Nets fans hate on Cam Thomas so much? Well, and this is the thing too. I don't know. And by the way, you have to anchor it in reality, right? So when I bring up this opportunity for what Cam Thomas could do and what they could try to have him grow into, it's easy for me just to, look at some of the numbers and use the eye test and think about how you craft the offensive end of the floor and say this is a possibility that needs to be explored. I think that's true. I think it should be. I don't know. Sometimes it can be that misery loves company. First of all, we've gone through waves of this covering the team, but it's once you get to a point, which I think the majority of the Nets fan base looks at Cam Thomas and says, elite scorer, he was buried too long. They should have had him playing more sooner. But now it's what's next, right? Like even beyond what have you done for me lately? It really is this next phase of how do we get to the next step here? And when you think about how good he's been as a pure scorer, then you go to the next step. All right, then fine. You're in the backcourt. Be a ball handler, right? Be a facilitator, be a table setter, because you can dream on what that would mean. So I think sometimes the weight of expectations are also associated with what it's going to mean for this team if we can get it across the line, right? If we can get player X, player Y to become this next phase, then next year, when we spike the high draft pick and we get Cooper Flag and we already have a guy that can do all of these things, now we're having a different conversation about how quickly we can turn it around. Because while Doug and I have talked about, hey, be patient, remember that it's going to be a long road. The rebuild could take a little bit of time. I think maybe I say half a year to a season sooner maybe than Doug believes, but this is how you get there. And a summer league for Jalen Wilson like that is how you start to dream of getting there. If he carries it over to this season and Noah Clowney's growth, right? Like those are the ways that when you drop in a couple of picks next year, of which the Nets have plenty, all of a sudden you can start to say, well, maybe we get ramped up a little bit sooner. And even if it's not necessarily wins and losses, but we look at the core and we say, okay, check, right? We have 3-4 young guys in our starting lineup that we believe are key contributors and that can be built around going forward over the next handful of years. So that's a big part, I think, of what goes on here. JMcG or JMG, excuse me. I don't know why McG. When is the episode? What is that? I don't know, man. That's a good question. We could do that this week, maybe. I'm glad you brought that up. Let me make a note here on the side. Yeah. One of the things we also talk about is like when we're going to start to tap into, this is a side note, when we get into the regular season, looking at college games and saying, hey, here's what we're seeing from X, Y, and Z, and being a little bit more expansive this year because it's going to be different than years past, right? When you have a 19.5 over-under win total, it's going to look different. So we'll see what's going to become of the Brooklyn Nets and the projections going forward into those draft classes. That being the case, my friends, on a Tuesday, we're going to go ahead and get out here, and we will be back in on Thursday for our next episode. I said, I'm not sure which way I'm going to go with it yet. If you get over to X, if you're on there, at Adam Armbrecht, go ahead and get yourself keyed in there because I may repost some of the questions I asked. There's a couple of good ones that some fans already brought up, so I'll get everyone's kind of feedback on that, and maybe we'll start to do a little bit of a hierarchy. Who are the best Nets players of the past? Where does the fan base stand on players that should go into the rafters right after Carter heads up there in this upcoming season for the Brooklyn Nets? So a lot of fun things, obviously, and we'll go ahead and continue to take a look at roles and expectations. And maybe some of these players, whether it's a Jalen Wilson potentially and how he needs to do certain things in order to elevate himself from being a really strong contributor off the bench to being a guy who deserves to crack the starting rotation, who maybe by the end of this upcoming year, we say, this is a guy that can be a starter as we start to build ourselves going forward. So a lot of fun things that we want to do here, obviously. Thank you so much to everybody that came in, that enjoyed themselves, that got into the conversation. And again, be sure to head over as a reminder to wegotnets.com for the free ebook, those 5 stories, obviously about great historical moments for better or worse in Nets history, but so much more beyond that. And we have a couple other things planned over there that we want you guys to be able to get involved in as well. Thank you so much for joining us. We will be back again Thursday talking all things Brooklyn Nets basketball.